at it, it's A, B, C, C prime, B prime, A. So it's like this as you're looking at it. It's called a chiasmus. It's called chiasmus because the Greek letter chi is an X. And that's what you have. A, B, C, C, B, A. You have the X. That's why it's called a chiasmus. So the writer arranged this material so that you have national judgment, you have military victory, and you have song of praise. And it's obviously it's not chronological, but he arranged the material so that the reader would recognize this order. You can leave that up there, Jeff, the whole time if you'd like. So what you have is A and A prime, David acting effectively in leadership roles the Lord assigned him. And then B and B prime, that's military victory, David's role as the leader of the Lord's earthly forces. And then C and C prime, what I mean by prime is like apostrophe, C and apostrophe. C and C prime is David's words of faith in the Lord. So it all focuses, 21 through 24, focuses very squarely, very obviously on the man David, acting effectively in leadership, his role as a leader in the army, and his words of faith in the Lord. That's all chapters 21 through 24. So it's not thrown together. It is arranged with careful thought. And tonight we're going to look at that very first one, the very top one, national judgment, Saul's acts, in verses 1 through 14. Notice the top one is Saul and the bottom one is David. Well, Saul did something way back, we read about way back in 1 Samuel. And what he did was he almost wiped out the Gibeonites. And it's years later, and the Lord visits some discipline. He visits with discipline upon Israel for breaking that covenant. And that's what this is all about. So that's why it's national judgment, because of what Saul did. The national judgment in chapter 24 is going to be what David does. David is going to take a census of his men, and it's going to be interpreted by our Lord as a lack of faith and a lack of trust. You're counting your guys. You're counting your ammo. You're counting your bullets. And you need to trust me that I'm going to give you victory. David took the census. He should not have. And the Lord brought about some discipline on the nation there as well. Very, very, very interesting, chapter 24. And we'll be there in a few weeks. So let's look at verses 1 through 14 of chapter 21 tonight and see what's going on here. Let's read just the first 3 verses and we'll make some comments, and then we'll read verses 4 through 9 and make some comments, and then verses 10 through 14. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David sought the presence of the Lord, and the Lord said, "It is for Saul and his bloody house, because he put the Gibeonites to death." So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the sons of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. And the sons of Israel made a covenant with them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the sons of Israel in Judah. Thus David said to the Gibeonites, "What should I do for you? And how can I make atonement that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord?" Stop right there. The writer has given us an explanation in verse 2 as to why these things are happening. And the reason they're happening is in Saul's zeal at some point in his ministry. He sought to extinguish, to annihilate all of the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites, you might recall, tricked Joshua. They dressed like they were foreigners. They dressed as if they had been traveling a long distance. And they came and presented themselves to the sons of Israel. And Israel, they didn't check them out. They didn't vet them, so to speak. And they made a promise to them not to destroy them. Well, as it turns out, they were not from a great distance. They were from right next door. Nevertheless, Israel made a covenant with them, made a promise, and so God is going to hold them to that. Well, later, Saul gets really zealous, overly zealous, for Israel and for Judah, and he almost wipes out the Gibeonites, and the Lord is going to react to that. So that's what happens. There's a famine in the land, and the covenantal aspect of David is stressed in this section, the covenantal aspect. Saul had treated the Gibeonites very wrongly, which was the cause of the famine, and God is gracious to tell us. And by the way, God is very gracious and merciful to tell David as well. You might wonder, why did it take him 3 years to ask? Because in this part of the world, it's arid. They're almost totally dependent on rainfall for everything. They catch the rainfall in different in cisterns and wells and barrels and all. They catch the rainfall because you never know when it's going to come and when it's not going to come. So for crops to go brown, for the rain not to come for weeks at a time is common in that area. So it's very likely that David didn't think there was such a major issue because that's common. But after the third year, or during the third year, David gets wise and he thinks something's up here because this is the third year in a row. And so he inquires of God, and God is merciful to let him know exactly what's going on. Israel, as we noted here, was just a moment ago, was almost totally dependent upon the rainfall and the dew in the morning for crop moisture. And as we said, poor harvests were not uncommon, and so they were not automatically seen as a sign of divine displeasure. But like we said, when the crops fail for 3 successive years, you note that it says that year after year in verse 1. When they fell for 3 successive years, then David gets the hint, and he goes to the Lord and inquires as to what's going on. The Gibeonites identified ethnically as Hivites. In Joshua chapter 9, they're identified as Hivites, Hivites. And they're identified here as Amorites. They obtained a protected place among Israel's. All by deception, they attained it. And their chief city became a Levitical city. In Joshua chapter 9, verses 3 through 10, and in chapter 14, chapter 8 and verse 25 as well. Their chief city became a Levitical city. But King Saul tried to annihilate them in his zeal, the very ones that Israel had sworn to spare. That's in Joshua chapter 9, verse 15 and verses 18 through 20. So despite the Gibeonite incorporation, as you'll notice here in verse 2, the Israelites remembered their treachery and refused to acknowledge their original membership in Israel. There were other groups that were assimilated into Israel. I can give you one, for example, Caleb. You remember Caleb, Joshua and Caleb? Caleb was a Kenite. He was not from any of the 12 tribes. He was a Kenite. But eventually, the Kenites were absorbed within Israelite culture into one of the other tribes. So that happens occasionally. It did happen occasionally. But from what we see here in verse 2, the Israelites remembered their treachery and they refused to acknowledge their original membership there, and they refused to allow them to be assimilated into a certain tribe. That's why you see what you say. They were called Gibeonites, a remnant of the Amorites. So verse 2 tells us all of these things. The writer, of course, is reminding his readers of things that perhaps they had forgotten. Well, Saul's attempted butchery of the Gibeonites polluted the land with their blood. An atonement for this required blood. If you shed a man's blood, another man's blood is required. So you did this to the Gibeonites. You shed blood So atonement for this is going to have to be from the blood from one of Saul or one of his descendants. According to Levitical law, if this is going to go away, Saul himself or one of his descendants is going to have to shed blood. In other words, going to have to die. Is what's going to, because Saul violated the covenant. When the covenant was made, or what was cut, again, back in Joshua chapter 9, verses 15 and following, Israel's leaders swore not to touch them. And Saul, in his zeal, violated the covenant. And God was merciful, as we've noted here, to inform David of the case, what's going on and why the famine is taking place. So David immediately went to the Gibeonites to determine the means of turning it aside. What do I need to do, he says to them. Verse 3, he said to the Gibeonites, what should I do for you? How can I make atonement that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord? He desires that the Gibeonites be a blessing to the Israelites. He's not saying, we don't want you to be slaves anymore. The Gibeonites were assigned log cutting and labor-intensive work like that. That was their responsibility. If they were to live within the borders of Israel and be blessed by the Israel's presence and live here, then they would be their slaves. So they assigned them certain responsibilities, and that's what they did. But David meets with them. He desires that the Gibeonites bless the Lord's inheritance. They were not slaves per se. They were virtual slaves, but not slaves per se. I mean, they could have left. They could have walked away. But in spite of that role that they had with Israel, David placed himself at the Gibeonite mercy by asking what he could do to atone so that they will bless the Lord's inheritance. So David, this is a good thing by David. He recognizes this is the judgment of God for what Saul had done. There's no reason here to be arrogant. There's no reason here to be proud and go to the Gibeonites and demand things and try to talk above them or anything else. David understands the situation. So he placed himself at their mercy and asked, what do I do? What can I do? David's request subtly referenced the Abrahamic blessing. Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3. Those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. Genesis 3 specifically says this. I will bless those who bless you. The ones who curses you, I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So there's a subtle reference there. The king could not bring a blessing to the Gibeonites, but the Gibeonites' attitude toward Israel changed to one of blessing. And the Lord himself would bless the Gibeonites. And that's what David desired. So he went to him humbly, asking, what can I do? What do I need to do? Well, verses 4 through 9, they give the answer. Then the Gibeonites said to him, we have no concern of silver or gold with Saul or his house, nor is it for us to put any man to death in Israel. And David said, I will do for you whatever you say. Wow. Remember, when you say that, the Lord may say, okay, this is what I want. David said it. So they said to the king, the man who consumed us and who planned to exterminate us from remaining within any border of Israel, let 7 men from his sons be given to us, and we will hang them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord. And the king said, I will give them. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the oath of the Lord which was between them, between David and Saul's son Jonathan. So the king took 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, Armoni, and Mephibosheth, who she had borne to Saul, and 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul, whom she had borne to Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Mahalite, say all those terms. Then he gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them in the mountain before the Lord, so that the 7 of them fell together, and they were put to death in the first days of harvest at the beginning of the barley harvest. Wow, is that bizarre or what? Well, at first, the Gibeonites refused to make any requests, much less demands of David the king. As members of a servile, alien subculture in Israel, again, Israel allowed them to live within the borders of Israel, and that's where they were. They had no right to demand material compensation, silver or gold, from Israel's former family, dynastic family, Saul's family. They also had no right to put anyone to death in Israel. No doubt the Israelites had limited the power of the Gibeonite courts so that they could not carry out a death penalty. Well, David allowed the Gibeonites to execute the sons of Saul except for Mephibosheth. 7 of Saul's sons were executed. That is, 2 sons of Saul from his concubine Rizpah, and 5 sons of Michal from her marriage to Paltiel. According to the narrative here, the execution had to be carried out to end the 3-year famine during David's reign caused by Saul's violation of the covenant with the Gibeonites, which is not recorded anywhere else in the Bible. But we do know they did it because it emerges here in this place. David protected Mephibosheth because of his covenant with Mephibosheth's father, Jonathan. This whole thing depicts also the fact that Saul's line was eventually reduced to one crippled man, Mephibosheth. There's no threat from Saul's line at all any longer. So from the most powerful looking man in Israel, remember Saul was a head taller than everybody else? From the most powerful looking man in Israel to one of the least imposing figures, Mephibosheth, who could never mount a rebellion against David. This is the men that they chose to carry this out. We'll have to get to it, but this, surprisingly enough, there was not a great deal of discussion, about the ethics of this. There is some discussion, but not as much as I thought there would be. But I think once we understand Saul's role nationally, that he did what he did, represented all of Israel, then I think this understanding will be a little bit easier. So verses 10 through 14. And Rizpah, the daughter of Ai, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock from the beginning of the harvest until it rained on them from the sky. And she allowed neither the birds of the sky to rest on them by day or the beasts of the field by night. When it was told David what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, I think that's how to pronounce it, Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done, then David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the open square of Beth-shan, where the Philistines had hanged them on the day the Philistines struck down Saul in Gibeah. He brought up the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from there, and they gathered the bones of those who had been hanged. They buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son in the country of Benjamin in Zelah, in the grave of Kish his father, and thus they did all that the king commanded. And after that, God was moved by prayer for the land. Rizpah represents perhaps the supreme expression of maternal loyalty in the Bible by doing this very thing that she does. Death had taken her 2 sons from her, but through her selfless efforts, her love for them, her tireless efforts, she made sure that they would not rob them of their dignity. So she protected them from the beast by night and the birds by day. Thanks to her efforts, her sons and relatives were given the honor of a mourned death. Her sackcloth bed provided her a small, sparse abode in which to grieve among the corpses as they lie there. Furthermore, until the Lord lifted the curse that had eventuated the death of her loved ones through the sending of the drought concluding rains, she protected these two corpses from being dishonored by the birds or by wild animals. And by diligently doing this, seeing to it that none of the bones were stolen or destroyed, she preserved the possibility of a dignified and proper burial for her sons and for the relatives. So this is quite a lady who did this. And when David learned of her vigil, he chose to reward her efforts and at the same time create a lasting memorial to honor Israel's first dynasty or first dynastic family, the family of Saul. So David ordered that the bones of those that had been killed and exposed be gathered up and taken to the appropriate burial site. Then David had the bones of Saul and Jonathan as well, and no doubt the bones of Abinadab and Malchi-Shua as well, two of his other sons. Probably had them exhumed from a burial site under a tamarisk tree in Jabesh-Gilead. That's way back in chapter 31 and verse 13. Brought all of these back across the Jordan River into the Promised Land and gave them a proper burial at that point. The whole section here, 1 through 14, stresses covenant. Israel made a covenant with the Gibeonites. They broke the covenant. There are consequences for breaking the covenant. David did the right thing. So you see a picture of David and his actions toward a people group that he could have wiped out, that were not strong, that were not intimidating, but David did the right thing. And so you see a king who made the right decision, who put on humility and went to them to find out what he needed to do. And he inquired of the Lord. It sounds like the David from before 2 Samuel 12, doesn't it? Since we saw the event in 2 Samuel 12 where he committed adultery with Bathsheba and then murdered Uriah, we have not seen this kind of this aspect of David's character. We have not seen him inquire of the Lord and find out, and then in humility go to people to resolve something. Since chapter 12, we have not seen that of David. It's refreshing to read about something, but this happened probably before Bathsheba's event. So, question, I think the big question here is, does God always judge on an individual basis? Does God punish the sons for the father's acts? Is this a violation of Deuteronomy 24? I believe it's Deuteronomy 24, which says the sons will not answer for the actions of the father. I do not believe it's a violation of Deuteronomy 24 because, let's explain it here. God's judgment often has a corporate dimension to it. Often has a corporate dimension. Saul, as king, represented the nation who made the covenant. And when somebody violates the covenant, Saul, who represented the king, or represented the nation as king, the nation suffers to some degree. And when we get to chapter 24, you're going to see the very same thing. Very same thing that happened to David. And it's a tough judgment as well. Very tough judgment. I don't see the verse right offhand, But the Lord gives David a couple of choices, and none of them are good to choose from because of what David did. You're the king. You represent Israel and the people. You make this action, you make a bad action, then you make a bad decision, then people are going to suffer for this. So does God always judge on an individual basis? No. Sometimes God judges from a corporate dimension. Saul, as king, represented the nation who made the covenant. The Lord warned his enemies that their sin would have adverse consequences in their families throughout their lifetime. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 5. Exodus 34 and verse 7. The Lord says there will be effects. There will be consequences in the later generations. Chapter 34 and verse 7 of Exodus. This is a familiar verse to you, I think. Verse 6, Then the Lord passed by in front of him, that is Moses, and proclaimed the Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin, yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and on the grandchildren to the third and fourth generations. Wow. Children and grandchildren. There are effects of sin that last that long. Are these people guilty? I thought of this. Were these 7 men, if they were believers in Yahweh, these 7 men were believers in, I have no idea, if they were true believers in Yahweh, these men were offered up because of what their father, their grandfather had done. Does that mean that they lost their salvation, or that they really were not saved because they were sacrificed, because they were the atonement to make this famine go away? I think these men very well could have been true believers in Yahweh. Did David go out? Did David pick 7 that he knew were just, disasters in their life and choose them? Doesn't sound like David to do something like that. So we have the warning, Exodus chapter 34, verse 7, Numbers chapter 14, verse 18. And we have examples as well. This is not the first time this has happened. You remember Dathan. Numbers chapter 16. Dathan's, Abiram's, A-B-I-R-A-M, apostrophe S, Abiram's and Achan's. Remember Achan, right? Their innocent children died along with their sinful parents in Numbers chapter 16, verses 27 and 32. Remember, the earth opened up, swallowed up not only them, not only the men, but their families as well. Does that mean necessarily that all their families were guilty? No, it doesn't necessarily mean that. But there are consequences, there are effects for sin. So this has happened before. This is not the first time this has happened. With divine approval, David permitted the Gibeonites to execute 7 of Saul's sons because of their father's crimes against the city. And the Lord did the same thing to David. The Lord took the lives of 4 of David's sons as punishment for his sin of murder. The effects of David's sin got Absalom killed, got Amnon killed, Tamar was raped. These are the effects of sin. Children usually experience the negative consequences of their parents' sin. God even punishes children for a parent's sin when he decides it is appropriate. But this is not always the case. Sometimes, as in the case of the exiles in Ezekiel's day, for example, God allows the children to choose for themselves whether to obey or to disobey the Lord. So it's, to find a nice, neat paragraph that captures all of the truth in regarding this subject is very difficult to do, because at times families are included in the discipline of the father, as in Achan's case, Dathan's case. At other times they feel the effects, as in the case of David's kids. That doesn't mean the kids are guilty. That doesn't mean the kids are cursed because they have a father who committed this. Absalom was not automatically cursed because David did what he did. Absalom made his choice. Made a bad choice. A lot of bad choices. So this is not the first time it's happened, and I do not believe it's a violation of Deuteronomy 24. I think when we understand that who Saul was, the king representing the country, it was the leaders of Israel that made the covenant. Later came Saul, who violated the covenant, and so there was a national effect, not an individual only effect, because of violating the covenant. Any questions?